have a dream.
Yes.
It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day
Yes.
this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed.
Hello and welcome. Those memorable words by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. still echo through the ears of all Americans, black and white. April the 4th, 2008 marks the 40th anniversary of his assassination, leading many to wonder what more he may have accomplished had he lived. During his life, King led efforts to end laws prohibiting blacks from using the same facilities as whites. He enlisted thousands in nonviolent marches and sit-ins to halt the segregation laws that kept blacks and whites separated at schools, restaurants, public buildings and buses across the southern part of the country. Today, the US is a paradox that King may not recognize. More than a quarter of black Americans live in poverty, although for the first time in history, the country may elect its first black president. Well, have Martin Luther King's dreams become a reality in today's America, or has the situation spiraled downwards? Don't forget, we take your calls on this show, and you can reach us at the numbers at the bottom of your screen. Joining me from Memphis, Tennessee, is the renowned civil rights activist, Reverend Jesse Jackson, who was not only a friend of Dr. King, mentioned by name in the civil rights leader's speech of April the 3rd, but was with him on that fateful day he was murdered. It's great to speak with you again, Reverend Jackson.
Very well.
Sir, I would like to ask, you were standing at that location that has a lot of historical significance, with the public, and I want to share I want you to share with us, for the public, what that place where you are now represents.
Well, Riz, there's a certain sadness here. The older I get, when it first happened, I was traumatized, but now I feel more deeply the pain of his being killed at such a young age, age 39. I think our government had a role in it. For example, FBI Director Hoover accused him of being a communist, a traitor to our nation, and got permission from Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, to in fact invade his home and bug his telephones and his offices and follow him in hotel rooms around the country in pursuit of trying to disrupt, discredit, and destroy him. They took that data, which had nothing to do with communism, and gave it to the press and helped to drive down his standing. So he died a very hated and despised man and feared without a foundation. So in spite of those odds, he lives now through his dreams to the hearts of millions of people, if not billions, around the world.
Now, I want to ask you about that time. We just saw a picture of you standing on the balcony where Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated, and you were there at the time. Of course, the picture is there, you standing next to him. I wonder how that memory has evolved for you. When you look at 4 decades going on, how has that feeling of what happened there, that fateful day, changed in your mind?
Well, that first day, that was a kind of joyous day. It's probably a picture of Reverend Abernathy, Jose Williams, Dr. King, and I. He was just coming into Memphis, preparing for the next big march, because he believed that we had achieved freedom, the right to sit on a bus or use public accommodation, or the right to vote. But freedom without equality had a certain emptiness to it. Now we're about to fight for a job and income for every American. He said, our freedoms, it costs no investment money. But to close the gap in infant mortality, life expectancy, health care, job training would require investment. So equality was the unfinished business. And we were determined we were going to do that. Going to Washington to engage in an act of civil disobedience to force our Congress to shift the Vietnam War budget to a peace budget at home. Later that day, we went to meet with ministers to urge them to prepare to form, if necessary, an organized economic boycott to leverage the private sector to challenge the mayor to recognize these garbage workers. And then that night, of course, he had not planned to speak. He asked me to speak, and Reverend Abernathy and then so Reverend Abernathy and I finally went to the church. And that was a great, tumultuous response. The Reverend Rev said, you know, Jesse, they're not cheering for us, they're cheering because they think Martin is behind us. And we laughed. Went to the back of the church and asked and called him and said, you must come. And he came that night. And it was an eerie feeling in that he walked back through his own personal history earlier that day. That night he walked through time and reflection. And then he said, there are these sick men trying to threaten to blow up the plane I'm on. But I'm not fearing any man or anybody. Mine eyes have seen the glory and coming of the Lord. He had apparently grappled with and wrestled with death. And I've seen the promised land, the new America. I may not get there, but we will get there. You know, 40 years later, we've seen a new America emerge, with new opportunities come from his living and from his martyrdom, and maybe the blessing and all of the sadness is this new America that we now see manifesting itself.
I'll ask you more about the state of America in a moment, but you know, James Earl Ray was put behind bars for the shooting, and I wonder to what extent, in your opinion, did the story of the actual crime end there?
Well, you know, I went to see James Earl Ray at some point in time, just to look at him myself. I'm convinced he pulled the trigger, but he didn't have the money, the motive, and the mobility to have done this by himself. To get away from where the shot came from, next door to a police and fire station, out of Memphis, across state lines, into Canada, with dual passports over to Europe, on the way to Africa. This was a team effort. I do not know the extent to which there was a planned private conspiracy, but I knew that the government's action toward Dr. King set the climate, because he was seen as a threat to national security. He is a man of nonviolence who died violently, a man of love died with so much hate. He is beloved today, but he died a very hated, despised man in an attack on him led by state-sanctioned terrorism, unfortunately and painfully, by our government.
We had this email from California, Reverend Jackson, I'd like to put to you. Bob Larrabo in California said, the laws and generally accepted norms in the USA now support equality between races in the USA today. This is a huge change from 40 years ago when discrimination was not only legal, it was institutionalized. On the other hand, the races live apart from each other, and there is still deep discomfort on both sides of different racial divides. We are clearly not a colorblind society. This is changing, but has a long way to go. And now I wonder, when you look back on that time, 40 years ago, 4 decades ago, with the civil rights movement, how did you imagine life in America would be for African Americans 40 years on, compared with the way it is?
Well, you know, 40 years later, we share new freedoms, but not new equality. People of color, black and brown, the infant mortality rate is higher, life expectancy shorter, worse education, more unemployment, less access to capital, industry, and technology. And there's not been the investment in equality there was in freedom. Dr. King argued that it cost America nothing to grant us freedom from indecency, indignities, and humiliation, but to equalize us and close the gap in education, health care, and job training would require some investment. We have not made that investment, and that's why he thought it would not just be for blacks, but for all Americans. In other words, when the bridge collapses in Minnesota and the levee collapses in New Orleans, it means our infrastructure is collapsing. And the way to put America back to work and make people have more meaningful lives is to reinvest in our own infrastructure and not so much in war abroad.
You know, I wonder how you feel black youth has changed in that time since you and Dr. Martin Luther King were active. How has the youth turned out compared with the way it was then?
Well, you know, Riz, segregation by race is illegal, but by funding, disparity is still legal. So you have inner city education and suburban education. Education based upon property tax values. So when industry shifts from cities to the suburbs, and the tax base goes, education base goes. So what you end up having, prenatal care, Head Start, and daycare on the front side, ends up with jail care and welfare on the back side. Or another data, 7 of 10 young black males don't finish high schools in America's major cities. And therefore you have the school to jail pipeline. 2.5 million Americans are in jail today. About 1 million are black, about 900,000 young black men. There seems to be no mercy toward them, not plan to elevate them, to make them more productive citizens. Well, the playing field is even. In football, basketball, baseball, we do quite well. But when it comes to access to education, health care, and jobs, the playing field is substantially uneven.
I was shocked to read the recent government statistic that 3 times as many black people live in prisons than they do in college dorms. But I have to ask you, why do you think, does that explain what you've been saying? Or if not, why do you think there has been no real leader emerging in the young black people of today?
Well, recycled poverty at some point becomes pathological. I mean, unemployment breeds unemployment. People who have homes, homeowners, children tend to own homes. Those who go to college, children tend to go to college. Poverty tends to recycle itself, and so does prosperity. Now, too many Americans who have not realized that prosperity. But our big challenge is to move beyond just the racial pathos into a broader class issue. For example, there are more white Americans in poverty than there are blacks. A coal mine in Appalachia, the mountains mostly inhabited by whites, dies every 6 hours. So whether white, black, or brown, hunger hurts. Therefore, there must be some commitment beyond our pain and separation to a new America with a new commitment to wipe out poverty and not wipe out the poor, to wipe out illiteracy and disease, and allow all people to realize their dreams. If you put $3 trillion in a war in Iraq, and lose money, lives, and honor, and then give huge tax cuts to the very wealthy, there's no money left, in fact, to invest in the common people.
Shah's been waiting patiently on the line to talk to you from the UK. Go ahead, Shah.
Hello, good evening.
Good evening.
Dr. King believed in freedom. My question is, did you achieve the freedom so far in the United States?
Okay.
He believed in freedom and equality. He said to have freedom without equality is to have rights without substance. So you are, without equality, without investment, you are free to starve, to be unemployed, to be unskilled. So there must be some infrastructure for equality. When Europe was under the devastation of the war after World War II, we didn't just say now that you are free, we must now have a Marshall Plan to rebuild roads and bridges and ports and put Europe back on its feet economically and have NATO to secure it. We've not had that Marshall Plan investment at home for America's abandoned. He said, therefore, bombs dropped in Vietnam. They explode in our cities unless we, in fact, have some commitment to invest in young people in their formative years and give them some hope and some future.
Mohammed's on the line from Saudi Arabia. Good to hear from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Go ahead, Mohammed.
Hello, Riz. How are you?
Hi. Good, thanks. What's your question, please?
Actually, my question is not a question exactly. It's a comment. I would like Jesse Jackson to throw some lights on it. Since we are discussing about the discrimination, we have seen so many examples in the history of America. And I think once long back, I know that recent Katrina disaster,
right.
It was all the blacks who have been affected. And recently the BBC was showing the venues there, which has not been at all, there is no development, there is nothing, infrastructure has been changed since it is same. So when we are talking about equality and freedom, I don't consider, because you see that
Mohammed, let me ask Reverend Jesse Jackson to look at that. Reverend Jackson, we've talked about Hurricane Katrina before when you've been on this show, and I wonder again to what degree you feel it's been a wake-up call. Mohammed's saying that really nothing was done following this, so and the questions are being asked why.
No, Katrina represents abandoned urban policy. In some real sense, Riz, 40 years later, the Kerner report described America as increasingly white, black, and brown, rich and poor. That gap has gotten wider because there's been no commitment. We call putting money in Iraq investment. Money for the poor is called throwing money away. So there's a certain contempt when it comes to fighting poverty, a certain virtue in fighting war. Obviously, those are retarded policies. We have some need to get beyond merely race as we seek economic justice and speak of race, gender, and religion, and no boundary between people and opportunity. I, for example, want to go to Iran and go to North Korea. We must pull down barriers and build bridges and lessen fears, and therefore lessen the rationale for more war budget and have more money left, if you will, for peace and development budget.
Of course, when we talk about war, we're talking also about the central theme in the campaign for the presidential race here. And I wonder, the last time you were on the show, you endorsed Barack Obama, and I presume you're still behind that. And I wonder if you believe Americans will vote based on credentials as opposed to race.
Well, we see more evidence of America voting on credentials, not on color. I think a lot of it has to do with this kind of athletic interchange here, where you pull the uniform color and not skin color. more youth going to school together, more people working together, less racial and gender fears. You see this transgender voting where you see now men voting for a woman and whites voting for blacks. That is a new, more mature America. We were always ready for this day, but whites were not ready. When Red Givers reached out, he got killed. Dr. King reached out, he got rejected and got killed. But now we see more Americans less fearful, less toxic, more courageous, beginning to even the playing field. And that is the best America that we have ever known, and we must keep that hope alive. It could very well determine the next president, be an African American or a woman. And that is maybe what Dr. King saw in that promised land beyond the mountaintop.
We've got Gibran on the line from Chad. Great to hear from Chad. Gibran, what would you like to ask?
Yeah, good evening, Riz. Good evening, Sir Jackson. I just want to ask Jesse Jackson, why the black businessman, I mean the Afro-American businessman, why they don't come back to Africa and invest their money over there? Okay. As long as there is no real change in the system in America.
We have about a minute, and I know Jesse Jackson, Reverend Jackson's been very active actually going across to Africa. So tell us what you think in response to this question.
Well, people should live where they choose to live. Many people from around the world come to America. Some are dual citizens. Some go back home and some stay here. But wherever we are staying, human rights ought to be observed. If we're going to globalize capital, then globalize human rights, workers' rights, children's rights, women's rights, and a healthy environment for all people. We must measure human rights by one standard that make all of us better and a world more secure.
A quick question by email before we let you go from Justin in Dublin in Ireland. He says, if Martin Luther King Jr. was alive, do you think he'd endorse Obama?
Well, he could very well. That would be his option. I think that just as Mandela is not the father of a new South Africa, Dr. King is the father of the new America. And I'm sure he would be delicate as he seeks to advance more participation. He would be proud to see a woman and African American as real live options to become America's next president. That represents the fulfillment of his dream, a one big tent America where all of us can figure in. He would be not so much choosing a candidate, but choosing a direction. And I think Barack and Hillary represent that new direction, that new hope, and that new possibility in the fulfillment of that great dream.
Reverend Jesse Jackson, always a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, sir.
On Monday, we take the show to Yale University in Connecticut to discuss global obesity. Join us for that. We'll see you next time. Street Talk is next.